There's an idea people repeat all the time. If you want someone to chase you, be less available. Take longer to reply. Act like you don't care. I've never been completely convinced by that. Not because those things never work. Sometimes they do, but only for a while. They create curiosity, not connection. And curiosity has a habit of fading once people realize there isn't much underneath it. The more I've paid attention to relationships, the more I've started believing something completely different. The people who are constantly being pursued rarely seem interested in making anyone chase them. In fact, most of them would probably find the whole idea a little strange. They're not trying to create distance. They're not trying to look mysterious. They're simply living in a way that gives other people room to become emotionally invested. I think that's an important difference, because emotional closeness doesn't happen all at once. It grows, conversation by conversation, moment by moment, almost so slowly that neither person notices it happening. Then one day, someone catches themselves wondering what you're doing, looking forward to hearing from you, smiling when your name appears on their phone. Not because you played the game better, because somewhere along the way, being around you started to mean something. That's the kind of attraction worth understanding, not the kind built on confusion, the kind built on connection. And I think it starts with something that feels almost backwards. Number one, you don't rush emotional closeness. I've noticed that when we really like someone, our instinct is usually to speed things up. We reply immediately. We tell them everything about ourselves. We want them to know how different they are, how excited we are, how much potential we see. It feels honest, and sometimes it is, but honesty and timing aren't always the same thing. Think about the closest friendships you've ever had. Most of them probably didn't become close overnight. You didn't sit down during the first conversation and tell each other your biggest fears. You didn't reveal every important chapter of your life in one evening. You discovered each other gradually. One conversation created another. Trust made room for more trust. Looking back, that's probably what made those relationships feel so solid. They had time to breathe. Romantic attraction isn't all that different. One thing I've noticed is that people become emotionally invested in what they slowly discover than in what they're handed all at once. Not because mystery is attractive by itself, because discovery is. There's something deeply satisfying about realizing you've learned something new about someone you've known for months. Maybe it's the way they talk about their family, a hobby they never mentioned before, a childhood memory that suddenly explains why they think the way they do. Those moments make people feel like the relationship is still unfolding. Now compare that with someone who reveals everything in the first week, their past, their dreams, their fears, their routines, their expectations, their future plans. At first, it can feel like closeness, but sometimes it's simply speed. And speed has a way of creating an illusion. You feel emotionally close before you've actually built emotional trust. The problem is, real closeness isn't measured by how much you know about someone. It's measured by how safely two people can keep discovering each other. I've met people who could talk for hours about themselves, yet somehow I left feeling like I'd skipped to the last chapter of a book. There was nothing left to uncover, no quiet surprises waiting 6 months later. Then I've met people who were completely open, yet never felt rushed. Months into knowing them, you'd still hear a story that made you understand them a little differently. Not because they were hiding, because life naturally unfolded one layer at a time. I think that's the difference. People often confuse gradual with guarded. They're not the same thing. Being guarded says, you haven't earned my trust. Growing gradually says, there's more of me you'll naturally discover if we're both still here.
One creates distance, the other creates anticipation. And anticipation is a strange thing. It doesn't make people anxious, it makes them curious. Curiosity turns into attention. Attention turns into investment. Investment quietly becomes attachment, long before anyone calls it love. The interesting part is, this isn't really about revealing less, it's about letting the relationship earn more. Because when emotional closeness grows at the same pace as emotional trust, people don't just feel attracted to you, they feel involved in your story. And once someone starts feeling involved, they naturally want to know what happens next. But that only works if your entire world doesn't suddenly revolve around them. And that's where the second behavior changes everything.
Number 2. Your life doesn't pause for one person. I used to think this was about independence. Now, I think it's about something much simpler. It's about momentum. Have you ever met someone who seemed to disappear into every new relationship? The hobbies they used to love suddenly stopped. Their friends barely heard from them anymore. Every plan, every thought, every emotion started revolving around one person. At first, it can look romantic, almost flattering. You tell yourself, they really care about me. But after a while, something begins to feel different. Not because they're doing anything wrong, because without realizing it, you've become responsible for too much of their happiness. That's a heavy thing to carry. The healthiest relationships I've ever seen looked different. Not less loving, just steadier. Those people still made time for each other. They still looked forward to seeing one another, but they also kept living the life they'd built before the relationship began. They still met their friends, still disappeared into hobbies they genuinely enjoyed, still chased goals that had nothing to do with romance. At first, I wondered if that created distance. What I noticed instead was the opposite. It created admiration. There's something quietly attractive about someone who's moving forward in life, not because they're trying to impress anyone, but because that's simply who they are. It changes the feeling of spending time together. Instead of feeling like you're filling an empty space, you feel like you've been invited into a life that already has meaning. And that's surprisingly different. Because people rarely become deeply invested in someone who needs constant attention. They become invested in someone whose life feels alive, someone they genuinely want to be part of. I think we've misunderstood availability. Being available isn't what creates closeness. Presence does. Someone can answer every message within seconds, yet still make you feel emotionally alone. Another person might spend the afternoon working, meeting friends, or chasing something important to them, but when they're with you, they're completely there. No divided attention, no half listening, no feeling like they're somewhere else. That's what people remember. Not how many hours you gave them, how present you were during the ones you shared. Looking back, I don't think people are attracted to busyness. They're attracted to purpose. Purpose gives your life direction, and direction creates something people naturally respect. Because when your world doesn't stop for one person, your attention becomes a gift, not something you hand out simply because you have nowhere else to place it. And strangely enough, people value chosen attention far more than unlimited availability. Which brings me to something even deeper. Because attention matters, but there's one thing people remember long after they've forgotten the conversation itself. It's how understood they felt while they were talking to you. Number 3. You make people feel understood, not just heard. There's a difference between listening and making someone feel understood. I didn't appreciate that difference until someone did it for me. We'd been talking for nearly an hour. Nothing dramatic, just an ordinary conversation. At one point, I mentioned something I'd been struggling with. They didn't interrupt. They didn't immediately offer advice. They didn't tell me about a similar experience they'd had. Instead, they said something like, "It sounds like you're less frustrated by what happened and more disappointed by where you are right now." For a moment, I just looked at them, because they were right. They hadn't simply heard my words, they'd understood what was underneath them. That's surprisingly rare. Most conversations stay on the surface. Someone tells us about a stressful week, and we reply with our own. Someone shares a fear, and we rush to solve it. Someone celebrates good news, and before long, the conversation has quietly become about us again. We don't mean to do it. It's almost automatic. But every time it happens, the other person feels just a little less seen. The people others naturally become attached to often do something different. They're curious before they're helpful. They listen for meaning, not just information. They notice what someone is trying to say, even when they don't quite have the words. Sometimes that's as simple as asking, "What was the hardest part about that?" Or, "How did that make you feel?" Not because they're following some communication technique, because they genuinely want to understand the person, not just the story. I've noticed something interesting. When people feel deeply understood, they almost always keep talking. Not because they've been encouraged to, because understanding creates safety, and safety makes honesty feel possible. Over time, those conversations become something people look forward to, not because every discussion is exciting, because they leave feeling lighter, accepted, known. That's much harder to replace than clever conversation. Think about the people you've repeatedly gone back to throughout your life. Was it because they always had the funniest stories, or was it because, whenever life became confusing, they somehow helped you make sense of yourself? I think that's what people remember, not the exact words, the feeling of finally being understood without having to explain everything perfectly. And when someone consistently experiences that with you, they don't just enjoy talking to you. They start looking for reasons to do it again, because being understood is one of the rarest emotional experiences we have. Once someone finds it, they're reluctant to let it go. But there's something else that quietly keeps that investment growing, something that's often misunderstood as mystery when it's really something much healthier than that.
Number 4. You leave something left to discover. This one is probably the easiest to misunderstand, because the moment people hear it, they assume I'm talking about being mysterious. I'm not. Mystery is often manufactured. Discovery isn't. There's a difference. We've all met someone who deliberately avoids answering questions. They never really tell you what they're thinking. Every conversation feels like you're trying to pull information out of them. That isn't intriguing. It's exhausting. But then there are people who are completely open without feeling completely known. I've always found that interesting. You can know someone for months, and one afternoon they'll casually mention something that changes the way you see them. Maybe they spent years learning an instrument. Maybe they once lived in another country. Maybe there's a reason they always smile when it rains. Not because they were keeping secrets, because life isn't something you can explain in 3 conversations. The people who leave a lasting impression don't try to reveal their entire identity all at once. They allow it to unfold naturally. I've noticed something else. When we really want someone to like us, there's a temptation to fast forward the relationship. We tell every important story, every dream, every insecurity, every lesson we've ever learned, almost as if we're saying, "Here's everything I am, now decide if I'm worth staying for." It feels vulnerable. Sometimes it even feels brave. But occasionally, what we're really looking for is certainty. We want them to know us immediately because we're hoping they'll reassure us immediately. Real connection rarely works like that. Think about your favorite book. If someone skipped to the final chapter after reading the first 20 pages, they'd know what happened, but they'd miss the experience of getting there. Relationships are surprisingly similar. People don't just enjoy knowing someone, they enjoy discovering them. The quiet conversations, the unexpected stories, the little moments where someone says, "I never knew that about you." Those moments create something powerful, not mystery, momentum. The relationship keeps unfolding. There's always another layer, another conversation, another reason to stay curious. And curiosity is one of the earliest signs of emotional investment. When someone starts wondering about you instead of simply knowing about you, they begin thinking about you when you're not around. Not because you've confused them, because you've become interesting in a way that feels natural. The strange thing is, the people who do this best aren't trying to be interesting at all. They're simply allowing life to reveal itself at its own pace. And that pace matters, because when someone feels they still have more of you to discover, they naturally want another conversation, then another. Not to solve a mystery, to continue a story they're enjoying. But that only works if you don't undo all that quiet investment the moment uncertainty appears. And that's where the next behavior makes all the difference. Number 5, you don't need constant reassurance. If I had to guess, I'd say almost everyone has been here. You send a message, a few hours go by, nothing. At first, you don't think much of it. Then your mind starts getting involved. Did I say something wrong? Maybe they're losing interest. Should I send another message? It's strange how quickly one unanswered text can become an entire story. The problem isn't that those thoughts appear. They appear for everyone. The problem is believing they must be acted on. I've watched relationships change because of this. Not because one person stopped caring, because one person stopped trusting. Every small silence needed explaining. Every delayed reply needed reassurance. Every slight change in tone became another question. Are we okay? Is something wrong? You seem different. None of those questions are unreasonable on their own, but when they become constant, something else starts happening. The relationship quietly shifts. Instead of enjoying each other's company, one person begins carrying the responsibility of constantly proving the relationship is still safe. That's exhausting. The people who naturally draw others closer usually experience uncertainty too. The difference is they don't panic every time it appears. They understand something that took me a long time to learn. Not every silence means distance. Not every delayed reply means rejection. Not every quiet day means something needs fixing. Sometimes life is simply happening. There's a quiet confidence in someone who can sit with that uncertainty without immediately trying to remove it. Not because they don't care, because they trust what they've already built. That trust changes the emotional atmosphere. People stop feeling like they're constantly being tested. They stop worrying that one busy afternoon will become a difficult conversation. Instead, they relax. And relaxed people usually become more affectionate, more open, more present. Ironically, the less pressure they feel to constantly reassure you, the more naturally they begin reaching out on their own. Not because you've manipulated them, because being with you feels emotionally light instead of emotionally demanding. I think that's something we don't talk about enough. People don't usually move closer because they're under pressure. They move closer because they feel safe enough too. And after watching relationships for years, I've started believing that's one of the biggest differences between attraction that fades and attraction that quietly grows. Which brings us to the last behavior. In many ways, it's the one they've all been leading towards. Because if you get this right, people don't just enjoy talking to you, they leave your company carrying something they didn't have before.
Number 6, people feel better after spending time with you. I've been thinking about this one for a long time, mostly because it's difficult to explain, not difficult to understand, difficult to notice, because it rarely happens in one conversation. It's something people only realize after they've known you for a while. Think about the people you've kept in your life the longest, not because you had to, because you wanted to. If someone asked you why, you'd probably struggle to give a clear answer. You might say, they're just easy to be around, or I always enjoy talking to them. But what does that actually mean? The more I paid attention, the more I realized it usually came down to one feeling. You felt better after spending time with them than you did before. That sounds almost too simple, but I don't think it is. Some people leave every interaction carrying something away: your attention, your emotional energy, your confidence, your time. You don't notice it immediately, but afterwards, you feel strangely drained, like every conversation became a performance. You had to explain yourself, defend yourself, prove yourself, even if they never intended that. Then there are people who create the opposite experience. You don't feel judged. You don't feel like every opinion has to be perfect. You don't feel like you're constantly being evaluated. You simply feel comfortable. That's surprisingly rare. I don't think it's because they're always cheerful or because they always know the right thing to say. Sometimes they don't say much at all. They simply create a space where you don't have to become someone else. I've noticed they do a few small things differently. When you're speaking, they're actually there, not waiting for their turn, not looking for a way to make the conversation about themselves. They're curious without being intrusive, present without being overwhelming. And when you disagree with them, they don't make you feel like you've threatened the relationship. There's room for different opinions, room for awkward moments, room for silence. That kind of emotional space is incredibly attractive, because life already gives us enough places where we feel pressure, enough places where we're expected to perform, enough places where we're afraid of saying the wrong thing. When someone becomes the place where all of that pressure disappears, you naturally want to return. I don't think people chase people. Not really. I think they chase experiences. They chase the feeling of being understood, the feeling of peace, the feeling of anticipation, the feeling of laughing a little more than usual, the feeling of being completely accepted for an hour. And eventually, they stop chasing the feeling because they've connected it to a person. That's when they start reaching out first. That's when they wonder how your day is going. That's when they find reasons to keep the conversation alive. Not because you've made yourself impossible to get, because you've become genuinely enjoyable to be around. And I think that's an important distinction, because one approach is built on scarcity, the other is built on value. Scarcity gets attention, value keeps it. Which brings me back to something I said at the beginning. People spend a lot of time asking, how do I make someone chase me? The more I've watched relationships, the less I think that's the right question. A better question might be, what kind of experience do people consistently have when they're around me? Because that's where everything we've talked about today begins. You don't rush emotional closeness, so people become invested instead of overwhelmed. Your life doesn't pause for one person, so your attention feels chosen instead of expected. You make people feel understood, not just heard, so they associate you with one of the rarest experiences they'll ever have. You leave something left to discover, so the relationship continues unfolding instead of feeling rushed. You don't need constant reassurance, so people feel free to move closer instead of feeling pressure to prove themselves. And perhaps most importantly, people leave your company feeling lighter than when they arrived. Those 6 behaviors don't guarantee someone will fall in love with you. Nothing can. Human beings are far too complicated for that. But they do something much more realistic. They make people look forward to seeing you again, then again, then again, until one day, without really knowing when it happened, they've become emotionally invested. Not because you convinced them, not because you played hard to get, not because you followed a strategy, because every interaction quietly answered a question we all carry around. How do I feel when I'm with this person? And if the answer keeps getting better, people rarely need a reason to come back. They simply do. So I'm curious, out of these 6 behaviors, which one do you think people underestimate the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed this conversation, I'll see you in the next one.